You are standing on an island in the Aegean Sea, long before the familiar names of Greece or Rome were spoken. The island is called Thera. Today, we know it as Santorini, a crescent-shaped cluster of volcanic cliffs. But in the 17th century BCE, it was home to a thriving outpost of the Minoan civilization. The Minoans are often remembered for the Palace of Knossos on Crete, with its labyrinthine corridors, painted frescoes, and myths of kings and monsters. Yet here, on Thera, their culture spread into something just as remarkable, an urban community at Akrotiri. This city was not legendary. It was real, ordinary, and quietly advanced. Akrotiri was more than a settlement. It was a carefully organized town. Its streets were paved and divided into districts. Homes rose 2 and 3 stories high, built with stone walls covered in plaster, decorated with colorful frescoes. Water flowed through pipes that carried it to cisterns and drains, a level of urban planning that much of Europe would not see again for nearly 2,000 years. Inside, the homes were not barren huts. They contained wooden furniture, pottery jars, cooking tools, and carefully woven textiles. On the walls, artists painted scenes of everyday life: fishermen hauling in nets, women gathering saffron, ships with bright sails gliding across the Aegean. These murals were not only decoration, they were records of the world that the Minoans knew. And it was a wide world. The harbor at Akrotiri opened to trade routes that stretched across the Mediterranean. Copper from Cyprus, tin from Anatolia, obsidian from Melos, and even spices from faraway lands found their way into the island's markets. The people of Thera lived not in isolation, but in a web of exchange that connected them with Egypt, Mesopotamia, and beyond. What makes this story unusual is that the Minoans of Akrotiri left no surviving written records. Their script, known as Linear A, remains undeciphered. We cannot read their thoughts, their accounts, or their poetry. What we know comes from fragments, potsherds, bones, frescoes, and the ruins of houses sealed in ash. Yet even through these remains, the daily life of the people can still be pieced together. They worked with stone tools but used them to build fine structures. They raised sheep and goats, yet their diet included fish, lentils, olives, and grapes. In the fields, farmers cultivated barley and wheat, using terraced land to catch the scarce rainwater. Women played important roles, not just in the household, but also in ritual and trade. Evidence from frescoes shows them at ceremonies, carrying offerings, and leading processions. What emerges is a society both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in the sense that people woke each day to tend fields, weave cloth, and prepare meals. Extraordinary in that they had created, on this small island, a miniature world of art, commerce, and engineering that would not seem out of place centuries later in the classical era. But beneath their feet, unseen and mostly ignored, was the true ruler of the island, the volcano. There was a caldera, a restless mass of magma and rot beneath the earth's crust. From time to time, tremors shook the island. Cracks opened in walls. Dust fell from ceilings. Fishermen noticed the sea behaving strangely. To the Minoans, such disturbances may have been reminders of divine power. Earthquakes and eruptions were woven into their myths and rituals. Yet in Akrotiri, life continued, even when the ground trembled. And here is where the story becomes both haunting and uncertain. Archaeologists have found no bodies preserved in Akrotiri. The city was buried in ash, its buildings sealed, but its people appear to have escaped. Did they flee before the eruption, sensing the danger? Did they board ships and sail away, believing they would return? Or were they caught elsewhere, lost to history without leaving a trace? The silence of Akrotiri today makes the question even sharper. Streets stand empty, rooms hold, jars still filled with grain. A potter's will rest mid-spin. It is as if the people of Thera simply stepped out, intending to come back, and never did. What, then, was the final day like? Was it a slow, creeping dread of earthquakes and smoke, or a sudden rush of ash and fire? And why, if they left? Did no one ever return to reclaim the city that had been their home? You can imagine the days before it happened, tremors rippling through the stone walls, the earth muttering beneath the people's feet, perhaps the harbor water sloshed against its moorings, even without wind, and the smell of sulfur drifted from cracks in the ground. For the Minoans of Thera, these were not unfamiliar signs. Earthquakes were part of their world, frequent enough to rebuild from. But this time, the earth was not preparing to settle. It was preparing to tear itself apart. Around the 17th century BCE, the volcano of Thera erupted in one of the largest natural disasters in recorded prehistory. Estimates vary, but modern geology suggests that the blast released hundreds of times more energy than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Entire cubic miles of rock were thrown into the sky. Ash clouds rose into the stratosphere, spreading for hundreds of miles, blotting out the sun. The eruption did not come as a single explosion. It unfolded in stages. First, there were earthquakes and venting of steam. Then came smaller eruptions, hurling pumice and ash. The people may have already fled by this point, taking what they could and escaping by ship. Yet the eruption escalated. A massive explosion tore away the center of the island, collapsing it into the sea and leaving behind the flooded caldera we see today. The violence of the collapse triggered colossal tsunamis. Walls of water surged outward across the Aegean. Along the coast of Crete, nearly 70 miles away, harbors were destroyed, fields inundated with salt water, and ships smashed against the shore. For a civilization that depended on maritime trade, the sea itself became an enemy. The ash cloud spread even further. It blanketed fields across the eastern Mediterranean, choking crops and killing animals. In Anatolia and Egypt, the sky may have dimmed, the air thick with strange dust. There are faint records of Egyptian texts describing years of poor harvests. Near Eastern myths that speak of darkened skies that may trace their origins to this single event. For the Minoans of Akrotiri, the town was sealed beneath pumice and ash. Walls collapsed under the weight, roofs fell in, and frescoes were frozen mid-color beneath the gray. Furniture, pottery, and even staircases remained preserved. What did not remain were the people themselves. Unlike Pompeii, where the dead were caught mid-flight, Akrotiri holds no human remains. The absence is its own mystery. Some suggest that the residents escaped in time, leaving their belongings behind. Others believe that ships carried them out, only to be lost to the tsunamis. There is also the unsettling possibility that bodies may still lie somewhere beneath the deeper layers of volcanic debris, waiting to be found. The silence of the ruins leaves only questions. The eruption of Thera has long been tied to myths. Some scholars have wondered if it inspired the legend of Atlantis, Plato's story of a great civilization swallowed by the sea. Others see in it echoes of biblical plagues or the Exodus. When skies darkened and seas parted, these connections may never be proven, but they hint at how far the shock waves of Thera traveled, not only through geology but also through memory. The destruction did not end with Akrotiri. On Crete, the Minoan palaces suffered in the decades after the eruption. Though not immediately destroyed, their trade networks faltered, their harbors weakened, and their fields poisoned by salt. Over the next century, Minoan power declined, and eventually, the Mycenaeans from mainland Greece took their place. Some historians argue that the eruption of Thera was the beginning of this fallen natural disaster that cracked the foundations of a flourishing civilization. What remains remarkable is not only the scale of the destruction, but also its preservation. Akrotiri today is sometimes called the Pompeii of the Aegean, but in many ways it is even more haunting. Pompeii gives us bodies, Akrotiri gives us absence. Pompeii shows a moment of death. Akrotiri shows a moment of vanishing, when people disappeared into history without leaving a trace of themselves. Yet, in the walls covered with saffron-gathering women, and the jars still heavy with grains, and in the delicate drains that carried water through homes, their lives are still present. Ordinary lives, interrupted by the most extraordinary of events. And it leads us to a question. If they escaped, where did they go? Did survivors carry the memory of Thera into other lands, blending their stories into new myths and traditions? Or did the sea itself erase not just a city, but an entire community of people, leaving behind only a hollow shell of walls and empty rooms? When the ash settled and the sea calmed, Thera was unrecognizable. What had once been a flourishing island community was reduced to a fractured caldera. Its heart collapsed into the sea. Yet the destruction of Thera was not a local tragedy alone. Its impact rippled outward, touching distant lands, reshaping economies, and seeding stories that echoed for centuries. The Minoans of Crete, so deeply tied to the sea, were especially shaken. Their ships had plied the waters from Cyprus to Egypt, carrying copper, wine, and olive oil. But after the eruption, harbors were blocked with pumice, tsunamis had wrecked fleets, and fields were spoiled by ashfall and salt water. For decades afterward, their society faltered. Palaces were rebuilt, but they carried the scars of repeated earthquakes and raids. By the 15th century BCE, the Minoans had lost their dominance, and the Mycenaeans of mainland Greece took control of their centers. Historians debate the exact role Thera's eruption played in this decline. Was it the single blow that toppled a civilization, or merely one disaster among many? The truth is likely in between. The eruption did not destroy the Minoans outright, but it disrupted the delicate systems trade, agriculture, and political order that allowed them to flourish. A powerful culture can withstand one disaster, but when nature, economy, and rivals align against it, collapse becomes harder to resist. Beyond Crete, the eruption left other traces. In Anatolia and the Levant, layers of volcanic ash appear in soil samples. In Egypt, some records speak of years when the skies dimmed and harvest failed. Climate scientists suggest that the eruption may have cooled parts of the northern hemisphere for several years, shortening growing seasons and unsettling societies far beyond the Aegean. And then there are the stories. Plato's tale of Atlantis, told 1,000 years later, describes an island civilization advanced in art and power, suddenly swallowed by the sea. Scholars argue endlessly over whether Thera was the source of that myth. The parallels are striking. An island destroyed, a people lost, the sea reclaiming land. Even if Plato did not intend Thera specifically, the memory of such disasters may well have filtered through generations, shaping the imagination of later Greeks. In a quieter way, the ruins of Akrotiri remind us of another legacy: the preservation of daily life. The frescoes of saffron gatherers, the ship flotillas, and the blue monkeys painted on the walls tell us that ancient people were not abstractions. They had routines, rituals, and joys. They loved color. They organized homes. They celebrated the world around them. The eruption preserved these details better than centuries of survival might have, sealing them away for archaeologists to rediscover millennia later. Today, walking through Akrotiri's excavation, you find rooms open to the air again, their stone walls still strong after 3,500 years. Staircases rise to nowhere, once leading to upper floors. In storerooms, giant jars remain fixed in the earth, and on the walls, fragments of painted life still cling to plaster. What you do not see are the people themselves. Their absence is the most powerful presence of all. So we are left with questions that will probably never be answered. Did the people of Akrotiri survive, scattering to other islands, carrying their knowledge and traditions with them? Or did they perish at sea, their story erased except for what the ash preserved? And what does it mean that an entire community could vanish so completely, leaving behind walls and paintings but not a single remembered name? The story of Thera's eruption is not only about disaster. It is about how fragile human achievement can be when measured against the forces of the earth. But it is also about endurance, the endurance of memory, of art, and of the traces of ordinary life that speak across millennia. The Minoans of Akrotiri are gone. Their voices are silent. Yet as long as their frescoes remain, as long as the caldera stands in the Aegean, their world is not entirely lost. When Mount Vesuvius is mentioned, Most people think of Pompeii, the bustling Roman town frozen in ash in 79 CE. But Pompeii was not alone. At the Volcanoes base, other towns also thrived, equally vibrant, equally full of daily lives. Two in particular, Herculaneum and Oplontis, offer us glimpses into Roman life that are just as telling, and in some ways even more haunting, than Pompeii itself. Herculaneum lay closer to the Bay of Naples, smaller than Pompeii, but wealthier. Its streets were lined with elegant villas, their walls painted with brilliant frescoes. Marble floors gleamed. Terraces overlooked the sea, where Pompeii gives us a portrait of a working-class town. Herculaneum gives us a record of the Roman elite at leisure. Oplontis, slightly farther along the coast, was home to sprawling villa complexes, including one that may have belonged to the family of Emperor Nero's wife, Poppaea Sabina. The people here lived lives defined by the rhythms of Rome, mornings in the baths, afternoons of trade and farming, and evenings of conversation and ritual. Herculaneum had bakeries, taverns, and workshops, but also an unusual concentration of luxury houses, mosaics of dolphins, cupids, and mythological scenes decorated the walls and courtyards. Fountains played over marble basins. The scent of garum, the fermented fish sauce beloved by Romans, drifted from storerooms and kitchens. Like Pompeii, Herculaneum was a town of both grandeur and ordinariness. In the bakeries, enslaved laborers ground grain into flour. In the markets, merchants haggled over prices of olives and oil. Children ran through narrow lanes, playing with dice and knuckle bones. Life was not uniform luxury. It was layered, complex, and full of contrasts. What makes Herculaneum distinct is its relationship with the sea. The town stood on terraces above the shoreline, its buildings cascading down toward the water. Its residents enjoyed breezes from the bay, and fishing was as much a part of its identity as trade. Oplontis, too, looked outward to the sea. Villas there were designed as retreats, with gardens, porticos, and wide views of the horizon. Archaeologists working in Herculaneum discovered something extraordinary: wooden beams, doors, and furniture preserved by the eruption, while Pompeii's ash incinerated organic matter. Herculaneum's burial under hot volcanic mud sealed and carbonized wood, leaving beds, chests, and shells intact. You can still see them today, blackened but solid, as if waiting to be used again. This preservation gives a rare view of Roman domestic life at Oplontis. Wall paintings still glow with color red, gold, and deep blue panels depicting columns, landscapes, and illusions of open skies. One villa contained over 400 amphorae stacked in storerooms, evidence of the scale of trade that sustained the empire. These were not poor fishing villages. They were hubs of wealth, consumption, and cultural display. Yet beneath all of this prosperity sat Vesuvius, quiet but never truly dormant. Roman writers describe tremors and fumaroles in the region, but the volcano's last major eruption had been centuries earlier. For most residents, the mountain was a backdrop, not a threat. Grapes grew in its fertile soil, villas lined its slopes. The volcano gave life, and its dangers were forgotten. In the summer of 79 CE, life in Herculaneum and Oplontis continued as usual. In the baths, steam rose from marble pools. In kitchens, bread was baked in clay ovens. In courtyards, families gathered under trellises of vines. There was no reason to suspect that these ordinary days would be their last. The eruption began in the afternoon of August 24th. At first, people may have seen only a plume rising from the summit, dark against the blue sky. They had no word for volcano as we use it now. To them, it was a mountain behaving strangely. Ash began to fall. In Pompeii, roofs groaned under its weight, but in Herculaneum, the wind carried most of it away. People may have watched, curious but not terrified, as the sky darkened. What they did not know was that Vesuvius was preparing something even more devastating than falling ash. Herculaneum spared the suffocating blanket that crushed Pompeii. would instead be struck by pyroclastic surges, avalanches of superheated gas and rock, racing down the mountain at unimaginable speed. But in this first stage, before the catastrophe, life continued. Lamps were lit, meals were eaten. Some packed belongings, uncertain but not yet desperate. Others stayed, trusting the mountain to settle. The question remains, what did they think, watching the plume rise higher and higher, ash raining in the distance, and the air turning strange? Did they believe it was temporary? Did they feel safe so close to the sea? Or did a few sense that the mountain they had trusted all their lives was about to erase everything they knew? The plume from Vesuvius climbed higher through the afternoon of August 24, 79 CE. Pliny the Younger, writing from across the bay, described it as a pine tree, its trunk of smoke rising straight into the sky, its branches spreading out in billows. To those in Herculaneum and Oplontis, it must have looked both fascinating and terrifying. In Pompeii, the fallout of pumice and ash deepened by the hour. Roofs sagged, streets filled. Families hid indoors or tried to escape through choking darkness. But in Herculaneum, just a few miles closer to the mountain, the wind carried much of that material elsewhere. The town may have seemed spared. Night fell. The plume glowed with lightning. The ground shook. Still, Herculaneum was not buried like Pompeii. People there may have believed the worst was passing. Some sought shelter in their homes. Others gathered near the shoreline, hoping the sea would offer escape. Boats had already carried many away earlier in the evening. But for hundreds who remained, departure was impossible. What came next was unlike anything they could have imagined. In the early hours of August 25th, the first pyroclastic surge descended from Vesuvius. This was not falling ash, but a rolling wall of searing gas and pulverized rock, hotter than a furnace, moving faster than a horse could run. By the time it reached Herculaneum, it had cooled slightly, but it was still lethal over 400 degrees Celsius. The surge raced down the slopes and into the town, filling streets and homes, rushing into the shoreline vaults where hundreds had taken shelter. Archaeologists later uncovered these vaults, finding skeletons of men, women, and children huddled together. Some clutched jewelry, others tools, and others simply each other. Their deaths were instantaneous, caused by the unbearable heat that vaporized flesh and froze bodies mid-motion. The surge also carbonized wood and preserved objects that would have vanished elsewhere. Roofs collapsed, but doors and beds, even food, were sealed in hardened volcanic material. Scrolls in a grand villa's library, reduced to blackened cylinders, survived, not legible at first, but still present, waiting centuries for technology that could read them again. Herculaneum disappeared beneath more than 60 feet of volcanic deposits. Oplontis, too, was buried. Its villas collapsed under the weight, their frescoes sealed in darkness. People there were caught in the same surges, their final moments erased in silence. For survivors farther away, the morning brought a changed world. The Bay of Naples was unrecognizable. Its shoreline extended where volcanic material had filled the sea. Entire communities were gone, replaced by a barren field of steaming debris. The tragedy was not confined to one night. In the weeks and months after, those who had fled must have returned, searching for relatives, homes, and possessions. What they found was only destruction. The towns could not be rebuilt. They were sealed to deep, too dangerous to reclaim. Vesuvius had not only killed, but also erased. What makes Herculaneum's story especially haunting is its paradox. Because the ash fell elsewhere, its structures, objects, and even would survive with astonishing clarity. Yet the people did not. Where Pompeii gives us plaster casts of victims frozen in ash, Herculaneum gives us skeletons and shoreline vaults, rows of skulls, rib cages, and bones. All that remains of families who believed the sea might save them. And here lies the question that lingers. Did they understand what was happening in those final seconds? Did they see the fire racing toward them? Or was it over too quickly for fear to take root? For nearly 17 centuries after the eruption of 79 CE, Herculaneum and Atlantis were lost to memory. The surface above them became vineyards and farmland. Villages grew, unaware that entire Roman towns lay entombed beneath their feet, unlike Pompeii, whose outlines were occasionally glimpsed when farmers struck buried walls. Herculaneum rested under an extraordinary depth of hardened volcanic rock. The first rediscovery came by accident in 1709, when a well-digger struck the buried theater of Herculaneum. Soon after, systematic tunneling began under the patronage of the Bourbon kings of Naples. It was a strange kind of archaeology. Workers dug narrow shafts, retrieving statues, frescoes, and marble panels, but leaving structures hollowed out and unstable. Treasures filled royal collections, while the broader story of the town remained hidden in darkness. By the mid-18th century, more careful excavations revealed streets, houses, and the famous Villa of the Papyri. This villa, one of the largest ever discovered in the Roman world, contained a library of over 1,800 papyrus scrolls, though carbonized into black cylinders. They were preserved in a way no other ancient texts were. For centuries, they could not be read without destroying them. Today, new imaging techniques, X-ray tomography, and multispectral scanning are slowly bringing their words to light, offering the possibility of recovering entire works of philosophy lost since antiquity. At Atlantis, excavation uncovered Villa A, with its dazzling frescoes, walls painted with illusionistic columns, gardens, and mythological figures still shine with vivid reds and yellows. Unlike Pompeii's bustling streets, Atlantis feels like a private retreat, a glimpse into the leisure of Rome's wealthiest families. Storerooms filled with amphories suggest a vast estate, supplying goods to markets across the empire. Herculaneum's shoreline vaults, excavated in the 1980s, revealed a different picture, not luxury, but desperation. The skeletons of nearly 300 people, preserved where they died, brought an intimacy and sorrow to the ruins. Some wore jewelry, others clutched coins, and one skeleton still carried a small key. These details remind us that catastrophe does not distinguish between status or wealth everyone. The shoreline faced the same fate. Together, Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Atlantis give us one of the most complete portraits of Roman daily life. Pompeii shows the busy streets of a provincial town. Herculaneum reveals the wealthier layers of society, with wooden furniture, scrolls, and fine houses. Atlantis preserves the grandeur of villa culture, its gardens and frescoes a vision of luxury. Without the eruption, these towns would have eroded or been rebuilt countless times. Their details lost, the disaster froze them, paradoxically saving them for us. And yet, the rediscovery also raises unsettling questions. We walk through these sites today as museums of the past, but do we truly see the people who lived here? It is easy to marvel at frescoes and statues, harder to imagine the voices in the baths, the arguments in the market, and the laughter of children by the shoreline. The eruption preserved their world, but it silenced them. The story of Vesuvius's lost towns is not only about destruction. It is about the fragile boundary between life and oblivion, and about the way memory is carried, not by grand monuments, but by small, ordinary details. A loaf of bread, a wooden bed frame, a child's toy. These details tell us that people in Herculaneum and Atlantis were not so different from us. They worked, loved, worried, and hoped. They live in the shadow of a mountain they trusted until one day it betrayed them. So when you stand today in those ruins under the Mediterranean sun, you are reminded of the strange gift the volcano left behind. A world preserved in silence, asking us not only to study it, but also to wonder what will be remembered of our own lives when the earth changes again. In the early 19th century, the island of Sumbawa, in what is now Indonesia, was home to a small but thriving kingdom at the foot of Mount Tambora. Before its catastrophic eruption in April 1815, Tambora was one of the tallest mountains in the Indonesian archipelago, standing over 4,300 meters high. Its slopes were fertile, its villages productive, and its people part of the dense trading world of the East Indies. The kingdom of Tambora was not large by the standards of European empires, but it was prosperous in its own way. Villages dotted the mountain's fertile flanks, where farmers cultivated rice, millet, and maize. The volcanic soil, rich in minerals, made harvests bountiful. Palm trees provided toddy and fiber. Forests supplied timber and resin. Fishing villages along the coast tied the island into broader networks of trade that stretched from the Spice Islands to the Straits of Malacca. The people of Tambora were skilled boat builders and navigators. Their ships, though smaller than the great Chinese junks or European frigates, carried local goods: rice, horses, honey, sandalwood to markets across the region. In return, they received cloth, ceramics, and metal tools. Linguists later identified their language as distinct from other tongues in the archipelago, hinting at an older cultural identity now lost. In daily life, the rhythms were those of many agrarian societies. Farmers rose early to tend their fields. Fishermen set out in small outrigger canoes before dawn. Women wove textiles from cotton and bark fibers, dyed in patterns unique to their communities. Rituals tied people to the land and the mountain itself, which loomed above as both provider and spirit. To live at the foot of Tambora was to trust its generosity while respecting its power. European records from the Dutch East India Company, though fragmentary, describe the region as lively and productive. Sumbawa was known for its horses, small but sturdy, prized by traders in Java and beyond. The people were described as independent, with their own chiefs and councils, not easily subdued by outside authority. The kingdom of Tambora itself was modest but recognized by neighboring states. In early 1815, life carried on as usual. Rice fields ripened, markets bustled, and children played along the shoreline. There were rumblings from the mountain, occasional tremors, and puffs of smoke. But these signs had come before and passed. The people had little reason to expect that their world would vanish in an instant, yet the stage was already set. Deep beneath the mountain, magma had been building pressure for centuries. Tambora was not a gentle volcano. It was a giant, storing energy on a scale no one living there could comprehend. On the evening of April 5, 1815, the first explosions echoed across the island. Residents of neighboring islands thought they heard cannon fire, as if a naval battle were raging somewhere at sea. Ships reported dark clouds rising above Sumbawa. For a few days, the kingdom of Tambora endured ashfall and tremors. But life continued, perhaps with a sense of unease. Then, on April 10th, the mountain erupted with a violence unmatched in recorded history. But before we step into the night of fire and darkness, it's worth pausing to consider this. The kingdom of Tambora had existed for centuries, sustained by the gifts of the very mountain that would destroy it. What does it mean to live so close to a force capable of both giving life and taking it away without warning? On the evening of April 10, 1815, the people of Tambora prepared for sleep as they always had. But in the mountain's depths, magma surged upward, breaking apart the rock that confined it. Just after sunset, Tambora exploded with a fury that no one in living memory had ever witnessed. The sound of the blast was so loud that it carried nearly 2,000 kilometers. On Java, sailors thought it was artillery fire from ships at sea. In Sumatra, Dutch colonial officials wrote in their journals that they believed a fort was under attack. Across the archipelago, people strained to listen for more cannon fire, unsure whether war had broken out. For the people living nearest the mountain, there was no such confusion. The explosion was not a sound, but a physical force. Villages were flattened by shock waves. Roofs collapsed as pumice stones rained down. The air turned black with ash so thick that daylight disappeared. Witnesses described the sky as darker than any moonless night, filled with lightning as particles clashed in the volcanic cloud. Then came the pyroclastic flows, avalanches of superheated gas, ash, and rock that roared down Tambora's slopes at terrifying speeds. Whole villages were erased in moments. The kingdom of Tambora once lively with farms and markets, ceased to exist. Archaeologists centuries later would find only traces, pottery shards, the foundations of buildings, and charred remains buried under meters of volcanic debris. Those who survived the initial blasts faced no easier fate. Ashfall blanketed the surrounding islands, collapsing homes and smothering crops. On Sumbawa and neighboring Lombok, people fled in panic, searching for water not choked with ash and for air not filled with sulfur. Tens of thousands died not from fire, but from starvation and disease in the weeks that followed. From a scientific standpoint, Tambора's eruption measured a 7 on the volcanic explosivity index, the most powerful eruption in at least 1,000 years. It expelled some 160 cubic kilometers of material, enough to reshape the mountain itself. Where once stood a peak over 4,300 meters high, there was now a vast caldera more than 6 kilometers wide and over a kilometer deep. Far beyond Sumbawa, the effects spread. Ships sailing hundreds of kilometers away reported falling ash. The sea was covered in floating pumice that made navigation hazardous. Sunlight dimmed as fine particles spread through the atmosphere. And then, in the months ahead, the global climate would begin to change. But for now, in April 1815, the tragedy was immediate and local. An entire kingdom had been annihilated, leaving no survivors to tell its story. What was once a distinct culture, with its own language, rituals, and traditions, was silenced in a single night. This raises a haunting question. When a culture disappears so completely, leaving only fragments for archaeologists to uncover centuries later, how much of its memory can truly be recovered? The eruption of Tambora in April 1815 did not end with the destruction of its kingdom. Its consequences echoed across the entire globe. The sheer scale of the blast had injected vast quantities of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, where it combined with water vapor to form a reflective veil of aerosols. This thin, invisible layer dimmed the sunlight that reached Earth, and with it came years of disruption. By 1816, the world knew something was wrong. In Europe and North America, it became known as the year without a summer. Crops failed as frost struck in June and July. In New England, snow fell in midsummer, blanketing fields that should have been green with corn. Across the Atlantic, Irish farmers watched their potatoes rot in the cold, wet soil, setting the stage for famine in Switzerland. The poet Lord Byron wrote of a sunless sky in his dark poem Darkness, composed during the bleak summer. Asia fared no better. In Yunnan, China, rice harvests collapsed, leading to starvation and mass migration. In India, unusual rains and flooding set off outbreaks of cholera that spread along trade routes. Grain prices soared everywhere. In some places, people turned to eating grass or bark. In others, uprisings broke out as hunger sharpened unrest. The death toll of Tambora's eruption is difficult to measure. On Sumbawa and Lombok, estimates suggest more than 80,000 people perished from the eruption itself and its immediate aftermath. Worldwide, millions may have suffered from famine and disease triggered by the climate shift. Yet beyond statistics lies the human scale. Families separated, children buried, and entire ways of life extinguished. The kingdom of Tambora itself was gone forever. Its language vanished. Its people left no written chronicles, only faint impressions preserved in European accounts and, much later, in archaeological excavations. In the late 20th century, excavations at Tambora uncovered what has been called a Pompeii of the East: homes, pottery, bronze vessels, and human remains entombed in ash. These finds gave us glimpses of daily life, simple meals of rice, tools for farming, and ornaments that told of craft and pride, ordinary details, frozen in the moment of catastrophe. Today, the caldera of Tambora remains. Tourists hike its rim, gazing down into the vast hollow carved by the eruption. Villages have returned to its lower slopes, the soil once again rich, and the cycle of life is resuming as it often does in volcanic lands. Yet the story of the kingdom beneath the ash lingers. As a reminder, civilizations are not only toppled by war or politics, but also by the indifferent forces of nature. The lost kingdom of Tambora leaves us with a reflection that is both unsettling and humbling. If an entire culture can vanish in a single night, what traces of our own world would survive? If nature chose to erase us tomorrow, in the lush valleys of what is now western El Salvador, centuries before the arrival of Europeans, a small Maya farming village thrived. This was not one of the grand cities of the Maya world, no towering pyramids or vast palaces like those of Tikal or Copan. Instead, it was a humble place known today as Siren, where people lived ordinary lives. And it is in the quiet ordinariness of Siren that history left its most haunting record. Siren sat on fertile land near the Loma Caldera volcano, a modest peak compared to the giants of the Pacific Rim. Its eruptions were infrequent enough that the villagers built their homes, fields, and ceremonial structures in peace. The soil was volcanic and rich, ideal for cultivating maize, beans, squash, and chili peppers, the staples of the Mesoamerican diet. Daily rhythms were simple yet meaningful. Farmers rose before dawn to tend their milpas, planting maize in carefully planned cycles that allowed beans to climb the stalks and squash to shade the ground. Women ground maize on stone metates, preparing tortillas and tamales. Children helped gather firewood or watched over turkeys and dogs that roamed the yards. Small religious shrines dotted the settlement, where offerings of food and incense were made to ensure good harvest and protection from misfortune. What makes Siren remarkable is not what was built there, but what was preserved. Around 600 CE, the villagers fled suddenly when Loma Caldera erupted. Ash fell quickly, covering homes and fields in layers several meters thick. But unlike in Pompeii, no bodies were found. Archaeologists believe the villagers escaped in time, leaving behind their possessions in mid-use. Pots still on the fire, tools scattered on the floor, and half-finished weaving projects abandoned on looms. When the site was rediscovered in 1976, archaeologists called it the Pompeii of the Americas. Excavations revealed adobe houses with thatched roofs, communal buildings, sweat baths, and storage rooms stocked with food. Even the furrows of cultivated fields were preserved in the ash. These were not monuments of kings or scribes, but the traces of farmers, artisans, and families, the backbone of Maya society. Through these remains, we glimpse the texture of life. Clay griddles blackened from years of cooking, storage jars filled with beans, and painted gourds used as containers. The details are almost painfully intimate, as if the villagers might return at any moment to finish their work. Yet the eruption made their absence permanent. To think of Siren is to think of a civilization not in its splendor, but in its ordinariness. Here were people who lived, worked, and believed, never suspecting that one evening their world would vanish under a cloud of ash. They had no way of knowing that their hurried departure would leave behind one of the most complete windows in the daily Maya life ever discovered. And so the first part of this story ends with a question that feels both archaeological and human. When we uncover the traces of a vanished people, are we truly learning who they were, or only who they were in the final moments before disaster struck? Sometime around the year 600 CE, the ordinary rhythm of Siren broke apart. The Loma Caldera volcano, which had slept quietly in the background of the villagers' lives, stirred. What began as faint tremors soon became unmistakable. The earth shook underfoot. Clay pots rattled on shelves, and dogs barked nervously at the ground. The villagers must have paused in confusion, perhaps reassured themselves it would pass. But it did not. As the hours unfolded, a deafening explosion shattered the evening. From the cone of Loma Caldera, a plume of ash and gas shot into the sky. Darkness fell not from night, but from falling ash that blotted out the sun or moon. Within moments, the air turned heavy and choking. Pebbles and volcanic fragments pelted rooftops, and the ground began to vanish beneath a rising blanket of gray. What happened next remains one of archaeology's enduring mysteries. Unlike Pompeii, no skeletons were found in Siren. Every sign suggests the villagers had time to flee. Doorways were left open, cooking fires still burned, and half-finished tasks were abandoned in haste. Perhaps they heard the roar of the eruption and made for higher ground, guided by instinct or ritual warnings passed down through generations. For those who remained behind even briefly, the eruption was merciless. Within a few hours, 4 to 7 meters of ash covered the entire village. Adobe walls collapsed under the weight, thatched roofs caved in, and fields vanished beneath layers of volcanic debris. The ash cooled quickly, hardening into a protective shell that sealed the village away for centuries. What was lost that night was more than homes, ritual, spaces, sweat baths, tools, and stores of food all disappeared under the ash. In the wider Maya world, Siren may have been a small place, but its silencing was part of a larger truth. The Maya lived in close intimacy with volcanoes, fertile soils balanced against sudden catastrophe. Loma Caldera reminded them that nature could not be tamed. The eruption's reach extended far beyond Siren. Ashfall blanketed nearby valleys, choking rivers and smothering crops. Neighboring settlements would have felt the tremors, smelled the sulfur, and witnessed skies darkened by drifting clouds. Trade routes may have been disrupted, harvests destroyed, and communities forced to scatter. In the fragile balance of ancient agrarian life, one eruption could ripple outward into famine, migration, or conflict. And yet, because the people of Siren escaped, their story was not one of annihilation, but of dispersal. They left no chronicles to describe their flight, no return to rebuild the village. Silence descended on the place, and the jungle eventually grew over it. For more than 1,000 years, Siren remained hidden, waiting for an accidental discovery by a bulldozer in the late 20th century. So the question lingers: when disaster forces people to abandon everything, what memories and traditions survive in their steps, carried to new places? For more than 1,000 years, the village of Siren lay buried and forgotten. The volcanic ash that smothered it had cooled and hardened, turning the site into farmland. Generations of people planted crops over the hidden ruins, unaware of the story lying just beneath their feet. In 1976, a bulldozer preparing ground for a government project struck something unusual: hardened walls of ancient adobe. When archaeologists were called, they soon realized what had been uncovered. What followed was one of the most extraordinary excavations in the Americas. Unlike most Maya ruins, which are monumental temples, plazas, carved stelae, Siren was entirely ordinary. It was not a royal palace or a ceremonial center, but a farming village preserved. At the very moment of its abandonment, archaeologists uncovered houses, kitchens, storage rooms, communal buildings, and even cultivated fields still lined with furrows. The ash had sealed everything in astonishing detail. Inside homes, ceramic jars still held beans and maize. Grinding stones sat where women had last used them. A kitchen hearth was found with food still in cooking pots. In one house, a half-finished gourd sat on a workbench, its decoration left incomplete. The excavation revealed not just structures but the lived environment, the layout of yards, the fences, the paths worn between houses. Even fragile objects like woven baskets and plant remains survived. Perhaps most revealing were the religious and communal spaces. A ceremonial building contained offerings of food, suggesting rituals tied to the cycles of agriculture. A sweat bath stood nearby, used not only for cleanliness but also for spiritual renewal. These finds gave insight into the balance of the sacred and the practical in everyday life. For archaeologists, Siren became invaluable. It showed how ordinary Maya farmers lived, how they organized their fields, stored food, and practiced rituals. Most other sites preserve only stone monuments of kings, leaving everyday people invisible. Siren, by contrast, whispered of real lives anonymous yet vital to the functioning of Maya civilization. Today, Siren is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Only a fraction of the village has been excavated, and much still lies protected beneath ash. Visitors walk raised pathways above the preserved buildings, peering down into a world frozen in time. The air is still, almost reverent, as if the villagers might return to finish their interrupted tasks. The legacy of Siren is not in triumphal architecture, but in its humility. It reminds us that history is not only the story of rulers and conquests, but also of farmers who planted seeds, mothers who cooked meals, children who played in courtyards, and families who once gathered around the glow of firelight. Their village was silenced, but in being buried, it was also preserved, an accident of fate that ensured their ordinary lives would not be forgotten. And so we are left with a thought. If disaster struck our own communities, what fragments of our daily routines, what tools, meals, or rituals would archaeologists someday uncover? And what would they misunderstand about us from the traces we left behind? At the dawn of the 20th century, the city of St. Pierre on the island of Martinique was known as the Paris of the Caribbean. Nestled between green mountains and the blue expanse of the sea, it was the cultural and commercial capital of the island, bustling with life and prosperity. The streets of St. Pierre were lined with theaters, cafes, and shops that sold everything from French perfumes to Caribbean rum. Cobblestone lanes wound past elegant houses, with iron balconies draped in flowers. Ships filled the harbor, carrying sugar, coffee, and rum from Martinique's plantations to markets across the Atlantic. The city was not only wealthy, but also cosmopolitan. Merchants from France, sailors from nearby islands, and workers from across the Caribbean mingled in its markets and taverns. Creole culture thrived here, a blend of European, African, and Caribbean influences reflected in food, music, and festivals. Visitors remarked on its sophistication, noting that St. Pierre offered luxuries rarely found in the colonial tropics: electric lights, a theater rivaling those in Europe, and a lively press. Above it all, however, loomed Mount Pelée, the great volcano that dominated the northern half of Martinique. It was a familiar sight, its slopes covered with forests and small villages. The people of St. Pierre did not see it as a threat, though it had shown signs of activity before. Most assumed it was harmless. Like many volcanic communities, they lived in its shadow with a mix of reverence and indifference. Daily life in 1902 followed the rhythms of colonial society. Plantation owners managed estates in the countryside. Workers cut cane and loaded sugar onto carts bound for the port in the city. Clerks tallied accounts in merchant houses, artisans shaped goods in workshops, and children attended schools that taught in the French style. Sundays brought church bells and family gatherings, while evenings saw the theaters and cafes filled with laughter, music, and conversation. Politics, too, was lively. Newspapers debated the upcoming elections, and citizens argued in cafes about candidates. The governor's office, located in St. Pierre, kept a careful eye on events, but seemed more concerned with colonial administration than with the rumblings of the mountain above. In early 1902, a few sharp-nosed residents began to notice changes: sulfurous smells, small tremors, plumes of steam rising from Mount Pelée. Farmers on its slopes reported ashfall that dusted their fields. But in the city, most went about their routines, dismissing the warnings as exaggerations. After all, St. Pierre had stood for centuries, and Mount Pelée had never brought it serious harm. And yet, in the quiet confidence of those spring days, the stage was being set for catastrophe. The people of St. Pierre could not know that within weeks, their beloved Paris of the Caribbean would be gone, its theaters silent, its harbor choked with ash, its streets empty forever. So here we pause, with a question heavy in the air. How does a city so full of life fail to hear the warning? Whispers of the mountain that towers above it. The first days of May brought mounting unease. Mount Pelée had grown restless, sending columns of ash into the sky and releasing rivers of mud lavas that destroyed villages on its slopes. Farmers abandoned their fields, and animals died from poisonous gases that seeped from cracks in the earth. Still, officials in St. Pierre assured the public there was no danger. To leave the city in panic, they said, would disrupt the upcoming elections. On the morning of May 8, 1902, the streets of St. Pierre were already covered in fine gray ash. The sky was dim. Even though it was early daylight, Some residents wore handkerchiefs over their mouths to filter the air. Others muttered prayers as they went about final errands. In the harbor, more than a dozen ships lay at anchor, their crews uneasy but bound by duty to wait. At just before 8 o'clock a.m., the mountain split open. With a roar louder than cannon fire, Mount Pelly unleashed a pyroclastic surge, a boiling avalanche of superheated gas, ash, and rock hurtling down the slopes at more than 100 miles per hour. In less than a minute, it reached the city. The destruction was absolute. The surge flattened buildings, ignited fires, and suffocated every living being in its path. Temperatures exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius. Wood, stone, and flesh alike were consumed in the blast. The ships in the harbor burst into flames as fiery debris rained down, their masts snapping and their crews incinerated. Within minutes, the Paris of the Caribbean was no more. Of its approximately 30,000 inhabitants, nearly all were killed instantly. The city that had once bustled with theaters and markets became a silent ruin of smoldering rubble and twisted iron. Only a handful of survivors are known. The most famous was Ludger Silberus, a prisoner held in a solitary underground cell with thick walls and little ventilation. Shielded by chance and confinement, he endured hours of heat and ash before being rescued days later, burned but alive. Another few survivors, including a cobbler on the city's edge and some sailors far out at sea, lived to tell of the catastrophe. For the rest, there were no stories left to tell. Families, shopkeepers, musicians, and children all were silenced in the same instant. The city's prosperity, culture, and elegance disappeared beneath layers of ash and ruin. The world was stunned. News of St. Pierre's destruction spread quickly, and journalists called it the most deadly volcanic disaster of the 20th century. But for the people who had lived in the city, the tragedy was not a headline. It was the end of every daily routine, every dream, every ordinary life. And yet, in the silence that followed, one haunting question lingered. Could St. Pierre have been saved if its people had listened more carefully to the warnings of the mountain? When rescuers finally reached St. Pierre after the eruption of May 8, 1902, they found little left that resembled a city. The elegant theaters, the bustling cafes, the cobbled streets, all were buried beneath a carpet of ash and rubble. Twisted iron beams lay scattered among charred stones, and the silence of death hung heavy over the smoldering ruins. The sheer completeness of the destruction shocked observers. Of the 30,000 people who had filled the city only hours before, barely a dozen lived to tell the tale. The bodies of those who perished were often unrecognizable, consumed by heat and fire. Ships in the harbor lay capsized or burnt to husks, their crews lost with them. The Paris of the Caribbean had vanished in less than 5 minutes. News spread rapidly across the world. Newspapers in Paris, London, and New York printed illustrations of the eruption, dramatizing the power of nature and the fragility of human settlements. Relief efforts were launched, but there was little to save. Survivors from outside the immediate blast zone fled, and the once bustling capital of Martinique became a place of mourning and ruin. In the weeks that followed, geologists and journalists visited the site, describing the eerie quiet. Ash still covered the streets. Occasional wisps of smoke rose from collapsed buildings. The only sound was the crunch of footsteps over debris. Many compared the scene to Pompeii. Though St. Pierre's tragedy was fresh, its pain was still raw. The disaster left Martinique permanently changed. The island's administrative capital shifted south to Fort de France, which remains the center of life today. St. Pierre was never rebuilt to its former glory, though some people later returned to settle near the ruins. The city's role as a cultural and commercial hub was gone forever. For historians, St. Pierre remains a lesson in both human resilience and human vulnerability. The signs of Pelly's awakening were clear: ashfall, gas emissions, tremors, but officials chose calm over caution, prioritizing politics and stability over evacuation. The price was catastrophic. Today, visitors can walk among the ruins of St. Pierre, Stone walls of the old theater stand in silence, their seats long empty. The remains of the jail cell where Ledger Silberus survived are preserved, a stark reminder of chance and fate. Museums display charred bottles, melted bells, and other objects recovered from the ash palm. Trees now grow where boulevards once stood, nature reclaiming the city that once defied it. And in the memory of the Caribbean, St. Pierre holds a dual identity, both a place of sophistication, where art, trade, and culture thrived, and a place of sudden ruin. A reminder that beneath every human achievement lies the unpredictable strength of the earth. The story leaves us with a sobering thought. How many of our greatest cities today built with confidence, pride, and the belief in permanence might one day meet the same fate silenced not by war or time, but by the quiet rumbling of the ground beneath them? On the island of New Britain, tucked into the northeast corner of Papua New Guinea, lies a harbor that seems almost designed by nature for ships. Rabaul, perched along its rim, was once one of the most important ports in the South Pacific. Protected by mountains and surrounded by the Great Simpson Harbor, the town became the beating heart of commerce, administration, and culture for the surrounding region. Yet all of this splendor was built under the looming shadow of Volcanoes, a fact that gave the city both its beauty and its curse. From the moment it was established by German colonists in the early 20th century, Rabaul was tied to the rhythms of the earth. The Germans, who controlled what was then known as German New Guinea, selected Rabaul as their administrative center because of its deep harbor. They built wide streets, government offices, and wharves for trade in copra and other tropical goods. But the choice was risky. The harbor itself was a caldera, formed by an ancient volcanic eruption. Several active cones still smoldered on its rim, most notably Tvor and Vulcan. Even in those early years, the volcanoes reminded settlers of their presence. Small eruptions scattered ash across fields. Tremors rattled homes. But the city grew regardless, as if daring the mountains to interrupt. After World War I, when Australia took over administration of the territory, Rabaul became even more central. It was not just a port, it was a hub for missionaries, traders, and government officials who moved in and out of the region. Daily life in Rabaul had a paradoxical rhythm. On the one hand, it was a tropical paradise. Coconut palms lined the shore, ships sailed steadily in and out of the harbor, and markets filled with yams, taro, and tropical fruits. On the other, the threat of disaster was constant. Ash sometimes fell like fine gray snow, coating rooftops and boats. Occasionally, smoke curled lazily from Tvor, an unsettling backdrop to church bells or school lessons. The people of Rabaul adapted with a kind of uneasy acceptance. Fishermen knew which stretches of coast to avoid when sulfur odors grew strong. Farmers learned how to clear fields after ashfall. Government officials made contingency plans, though often these were more hopeful than practical. The local Tolai people, whose ancestors had long lived with the volcanoes, carried their own oral histories of fire and destruction warnings that the settlers rarely heeded. By the 1930s, those warnings became reality. In 1937, a violent double eruption of Tvor and Vulcan nearly erased Rabaul. Thousands of people died, and the colonial government briefly considered moving the capital elsewhere. Yet the harbor's strategic importance was too great, and rebuilding began almost immediately. The memory of the eruption lingered, but daily routines soon resumed. Ships returned, businesses reopened, and children once again played on streets that had been covered in ash. World War II brought a different kind of destruction. In 1942, Japanese forces captured Rabaul and transformed it into their most important base in the South Pacific. They dug miles of tunnels into the volcanic hills, turning nature's features into fortresses. Allied bombers rained destruction on the city for years. But even then, the volcanoes stood silent, as if waiting. By the late 20th century, Rabaul was once again thriving. Markets bustled with trade, cultural festivals drew people from across the Pacific, and the city became a symbol of resilience. Yet beneath the surface, Tvor and Vulcan stirred quietly. their magma chambers restless. Scientists monitoring the region issued warnings, but many residents dismissed them. After all, Rabaul had survived eruptions and wars alike. It was as if the city had grown accustomed to living on borrowed time. The stage was set for another reckoning. The year was 1994, and the world was about to see Rabaul buried once again, this time in a matter of hours. In the early morning hours of September 19, 1994, the people of Rabaul awoke to an island holding its breath for weeks. Scientists at the Rabaul Volcanological Observatory had warned that the city's twin giants Tvor and Vulcan were restless. Seismic activity had grown more intense, gases hissed from vents, and the ground itself trembled with uneasy energy. Yet for many residents, the warnings blended into the background of ordinary life. Rabaul had always lived with volcanoes, and many assumed this would be just another false alarm. By dawn, the false sense of calm shattered. At 6:06 a.m., Tvor exploded. A deafening roar tore through the city, followed by a towering column of ash and fire. Almost simultaneously, Vulcan erupted across the harbor, unleashing its own fury. Within minutes, the sky darkened as if night had returned, and a rain of ash began to fall. Witnesses described the eruption as apocalyptic. Daylight vanished, replaced by choking darkness. Ash fell so thickly that within an hour, visibility dropped to only a few meters. Roofs collapsed under the weight, burying homes and trapping families inside. The air filled with the acrid stench of sulfur, making breathing a struggle. Panic spread as thousands of people fled the city, clutching what little they could carry. The twin eruptions created a nightmare of noise and destruction. Explosions shook the ground. Lightning crackled inside the ash clouds, a phenomenon known as volcanic lightning, which turned the blackened sky into a flickering storm. Ships in the harbor scrambled to escape, their decks coated with ash. Cars stalled as engines clogged with volcanic dust, forcing many to abandon vehicles and flee on foot. Despite the chaos, there was one critical difference between 1994 and 1937: preparation. The Volcanological Observatory had worked tirelessly to monitor the volcanoes and had convinced authorities to plan evacuations in advance. The military and local officials had mapped out escape routes, staged buses, and warned residents repeatedly in the days leading up to the disaster. When the eruption came, tens of thousands were able to flee almost immediately. Even so, the eruption was overwhelming. By mid-morning, Rabaul was unrecognizable. Tvor's ashfall buried the eastern part of the city under meters of gray dust, while Vulcan's blast destroyed villages on the western shore. Entire neighborhoods disappeared, their outlines reduced to faint mounds beneath the ash. The once bustling central market collapsed, schools crumbled, and the proud harbor became a graveyard of half-sunken vessels. The exodus of people resembled wartime evacuations. Streams of residents trudged through falling ash, faces covered with cloths to filter the air. Many carried children or elderly relatives, struggling against the weight of belongings and the suffocating air. Government convoys moved as quickly as they could, but the sheer scale of the evacuation was staggering. Over 50,000 people fled within hours. By the time the eruptions began to subside later that day, Rabaul was gone. Tvor continued to belch ash for weeks, creating a wasteland where a city had stood. Trees bent under the weight of ash, their branches snapping like brittle sticks. Birds and animals lay dead, suffocated by the fallout. The harbor, once known as one of the most beautiful in the Pacific, was choked with floating debris. Miraculously, the death toll was far lower than in 1937, thanks to early warnings and coordinated evacuations. Fewer than 20 lives were lost, tragic, yet astonishingly small compared to the scale of destruction. In the middle of disaster, preparation had made the difference between survival and catastrophe. Still, the city itself was ruined. Government buildings, churches, and businesses were buried. The streets were impassable, the air unbreathable, and water supplies contaminated. For the tens of thousands who had called Rabaul home, the question became not whether they could return, but whether they should. The island faced a dilemma. Should Rabaul, so often destroyed by fire and ash, be rebuilt yet again? Or had the volcanoes finally won their claim to the land? When the eruptions of September 1994 finally settled, the scene was otherworldly. Rabaul, once the proud administrative and commercial hub of New Britain, was entombed in a gray desert. Ash covered every surface. The air remained thick with dust for days, making breathing a conscious act. Buildings that had not collapsed stood half buried, their roofs just barely peeking above the mounds. The smell of sulfur lingered, mixed with the acrid scent of burned timber. The government of Papua New Guinea faced a stark decision. Should they attempt to clear the city, rebuild, and risk the wrath of the volcanoes again, or should they accept defeat and move the capital? Elsewhere, history had already provided an answer. After the 1937 disaster, officials had considered relocating, but the lure of Rabaul's harbor proved irresistible. In 1994, with the memory of ashfall fresh in everyone's lungs, they made the harder choice. The provincial capital would move to Kokopo, about 20 kilometers away, beyond the reach of Taverver and Vulcan. For the tens of thousands displaced, life in Kokopo and other surrounding towns was not easy. Families crowded into makeshift shelters, or stayed with relatives. Schools were reorganized. Businesses scrambled to reopen, and government offices functioned from temporary buildings. The transition fractured communities that had long revolved around Rabaul's markets, churches, and waterfront, yet it also marked a recognition. The volcanoes had spoken, and humans would have to bend. Even so, Rabaul did not vanish entirely. Some residents returned to salvage belongings or to live among the ruins. Farmers learned to work with the volcanic soil, which, once cooled, could be surprisingly fertile. Small businesses reopened on the outskirts, and fishermen continued to use the harbor. Over time, Rabaul became less a capital and more a ghost city with pockets of life. Its skeletal ruins are a reminder of both destruction and endurance. The scars of 1994 remained visible decades later. Tourists visiting the region could walk through streets still half buried in ash, the outlines of cars frozen where they stalled during the evacuation. The shell of the old Queen Elizabeth Park Stadium, once a gathering place for celebrations, lay silent under volcanic rubble. Nearby, the Rabaul Volcanological Observatory continued its watch, a lonely sentinel tasked with listening to the restless earth. For the local Tolai people, the eruptions were not just a geological event, but a reaffirmation of cultural memory. Oral histories had long spoken of fire mountains that reshaped the land. Warnings carried across generations. In their view, the volcanoes were not enemies but powerful neighbors, forces to be respected and accommodated. Western officials, often focused on economic calculations, had dismissed those stories in the past. After 1994, they carried a weight that could no longer be ignored. In the broader story of the Pacific, Rabaul became a cautionary tale. A city can thrive for decades, even centuries, in the shadow of volcanoes, but nature writes the final chapter. Rabaul had been destroyed by war, rebuilt, destroyed by eruption, rebuilt again, and finally humbled. Its harbor, beautiful but treacherous, remained a jewel of geography, yet one claimed again and again by the same forces that created it. Today, Kokopo thrives as the administrative center of East New Britain, while Rabaul endures as a symbolist city that lived on the edge, fell repeatedly, and still refused to vanish entirely. It is a story of resilience, yes, but also of humility. Human ambition raised a capital and the mouth of a caldera. The volcanoes reminded them who truly owned the land. Standing among Rabaul's ruins, one cannot help but wonder. In a world where cities continue to grow at the feet of volcanoes, Naples under Vesuvius, Quito beneath Pichincha, Tokyo near Fuji, how many more Rabauls wait silently, unaware that their reckoning has already begun beneath the ground? Long before the world heard the name St. Pierre, the slopes of Mount Pelly in northern Martinique were dotted with smaller villages. These were not the glamorous centers of trade or politics, but places where ordinary people lived quiet lives. Fishermen hauled nets from the Caribbean Sea. Farmers cultivated sugar cane and bananas on fertile volcanic soils, and families built simple homes along narrow coastal paths. To most outsiders, these villages seemed insignificant compared to the bustling Paris of the Caribbean, yet for those who lived there, they were entire worlds. The land was both generous and unforgiving. Pelly's slopes provided rich soils, nourished by centuries of volcanic ash. But they also reminded residents of the mountain's temper. Small eruptions and gas emissions occurred from time to time, leaving behind stories the parents passed on to children. These tales were not told in the language of science, but in the rhythm of survival. Watch the mountain, respect the mountain, and never forget what it can do. By the late 19th century, Martinique was part of the French colonial empire, and life in the villages was shaped by both tradition and colonial administration. Plantations demanded labor, trade routes carried goods to Europe, and Catholic churches anchored local communities. In these villages, daily routines unfolded with little fanfare. Roosters called at dawn, children fetched water from streams, and markets sold cassava, fish, and fruit under the Caribbean sun. Yet just as in St. Pierre, the shadow of Pelly loomed large. Residents noticed strange signs as the 20th century approached. Sulfurous smells drifted from cracks in the earth. Springs that had long flowed clean grew hot or discolored. Farmers reported hearing low rumbles from deep inside the mountain at night, like a drumbeat beneath the soil. Many dismissed these as curiosities, but the elders remembered older stories, warnings that the mountain did not stay silent forever. When 1900 arrived, those warnings sharpened. In April, Pelly began releasing visible plumes of steam. Ash drifted down onto fields, coating leaves in a gray powder. Birds flew erratically, and animals refused to graze. Villagers spoke of an uneasiness in the air, a heaviness that seemed to press on both lungs and hearts. The colonial authorities, focused on St. Pierre, issued few instructions to the smaller settlements. Life went on, though with more glances toward the summit. These villages had no theaters or busy harbors to draw global attention, but they had lives just as rich, families gathering around small fires, children playing in courtyards, fishermen mending nets along the shore. The coming weeks would erase them so completely that in many cases, not even names would remain on maps. When Pelly finally unleashed its fury in May 1902, the focus of the world turned almost entirely to St. Pierre. Yet the villages that lay closer to the mountain's base, smaller, poorer, and less recorded, vanished into the same cloud of fire and ash. Their stories are harder to trace, not because they matter less, but because history tends to remember capitals, not hamlets. And yet, if we look closely, we can still hear echoes of those lost places in parish records, in survivors' memories, and in the silent ruins reclaimed by jungle. But what, exactly, did Pelly's eruption do to these forgotten communities, and why have their names slipped so easily from memory, while St. Pierre remains famous worldwide? The eruption of May 8, 1902, is remembered for the annihilation of St. Pierre. But Pelly's fury did not confine itself to the city. The volcano's pyroclastic flows, those fast-moving avalanches of superheated gas, ash, and rock, swept down every side of the mountain, obliterating whatever lay in their path. The villages on Pelly's slopes and foothills were the first to be touched, and for many of them, the last moment of life came even before St. Pierre's final scream. On the morning of the eruption, thick black clouds gathered around the summit. To the villagers below, it looked as though the mountain was draped in smoke. Within moments, the clouds turned into torrents of fire and ash that roared down gullies and ravines. Unlike slow-moving lava, pyroclastic surges traveled at hundreds of kilometers per hour. Escape was nearly impossible. Chickens froze mid-step, dogs collapsed mid-run, and people caught outdoors never had a chance to take shelter. One of the most affected settlements was Montrouge, a parish community nestled on Pelly's southern flank, known for its small church and simple markets. It was a place where families lived quietly, many working in nearby fields. Survivors from distant villages later recalled that Mer Rouge disappeared almost instantly. Its houses reduced to smoldering ruins. Its church bells silenced in mid-peal. Another village, Ajupabu Willen, further inland, suffered similarly. Wooden houses, already fragile, ignited like tinder as the hot gases passed over them. Witnesses described the air itself catching fire. A wall of heat so intense that it killed not by crushing but by searing lungs and skin in an instant. For communities like Ajupabu Willen, there was no rescue, no evacuation, and almost no record left behind. The colonial administration, overwhelmed by the disaster in Saint Pierre, hardly documented these smaller tragedies. Reports from priests, missionaries, and scattered survivors are often the only traces we have. Some mention families who fled days earlier after smelling sulfur or hearing tremors. Others note that entire hamlets vanished so completely that only stone foundations remain. The difference between the city and the village was stark. Saint Pierre drew international headlines, illustrations, and relief efforts. The villages, by contrast, slipped quietly into obscurity. Ships did not carry news of their destruction to Paris or Newark. Their losses were absorbed into the larger catastrophe, their names preserved only in local memory. For those who later walked the ruined landscape, the devastation was hard to comprehend. Coconut groves lay flattened as though by a giant hand. Streams boiled dry. Cattle were found standing upright, their bodies petrified by heat and mid-motion. The jungle itself seemed burned into silence, stripped of color and life. And yet, as survivors mourned, the question began to surface. Why had these warnings been ignored? Villagers had noticed changes, strange gases, trembling ground, even small eruptions in the weeks prior. But officials reassured them, insisting there was no danger, particularly with important elections looming in Saint Pierre. Many villagers trusted these words. Others simply had no means to leave. In the end, the mountain chose for them. The story of Pellé's ghost villages is therefore not only one of natural disaster, but also of forgotten humanity. These were places where daily routines carried on until the very last moment, children playing, mothers cooking, fathers working the fields before all was erased in a sweep of ash. But if these places vanished so completely, how do we know they were ever there? What fragments of memory, record, or ruin remained to testify that lives were lived under Pellé's shadow? When the smoke cleared and the ash began to settle, the world's eyes fixed on Saint Pierre. The scale of that city's destruction, 30,000 lives extinguished in minutes, was enough to overwhelm reporters, scientists, and colonial officials alike. Relief ships sailed to the ruined port. Newspapers published sketches of the flattened streets, and aid appeals emphasized the tragedy of the Paris of the Caribbean. Meanwhile, the smaller communities on Pellé's slopes faded quietly into absence. There were no dramatic illustrations of Mer Rouge, no headlines about Ajupabu Willen, and no lengthy reports on the nameless hamlets erased in the eruption's first wave. Their loss was absorbed into the greater catastrophe, like footnotes to a main event. Yet to those who had lived there, these villages were not footnotes. They were home. Archaeological and historical traces show that life in those places was real and rich. Parish records list baptisms, marriages, and funerals, each name representing a family that once tilled fields or hauled nets from the sea. Charred ruins of small churches, their stone walls still standing decades later, mark where congregations once gathered to sing hymns. Foundations of wooden houses, swallowed by vines, whisper that entire generations grew up beneath Pellé's shadow. Survivors carried fragments of memory with them. Families who had fled before the eruption remembered the patterns of village life, the taste of cassava bread cooked on iron griddles, the sound of children chasing goats along narrow paths, and the sight of smoke curling from kitchen fires at dusk. These details, though mundane, became sacred because they were all that remained. For Martinique as a whole, the ghost villages shaped a quieter legacy. They reinforced a lesson that had long circulated in local oral tradition. The mountain does not belong to us. We belong to the mountain. The Tolai in New Guinea spoke similarly of their fire. Mountains and the Ada of the Philippines did the same around Pinatubo. Across cultures, communities living near volcanoes recognize the balance between fertile land and fatal danger. The forgotten villages of Pele embody the balance in its most tragic form today. Tourists visiting Martinique often walk the ruins of Saint Pierre, but few realize that beyond the city lie scars, hidden by jungle. Paths that once led to small settlements now vanish into thick greenery. Stone walls, collapsed wells, and fragments of pottery occasionally surface. Reminders that entire communities once thrived where silence now reigns. In a way, the jungle became both a shroud and a guardian, concealing what remained while protecting it from further disturbance. The story of Pele's ghost villages asks us to widen our gaze. History remembers capitals, monuments, and disasters on a grand scale. Yet the truest measure of catastrophe lies not only in ruined theaters and harbors, but also in the small kitchens, fields, and courtyards where everyday lives were lived. The people of Mern Rouge, Ajupabu Willen, and countless unnamed hamlets did not write books or command governments, but their lives mattered every bit as much as those in Saint Pierre. Standing on Pele's slopes today, surrounded by lush greenery that has reclaimed the scars, one might wonder, how many other villages across the world have been erased so completely that only whispers remain? And in our own time, how many small communities noticed, undocumented, could vanish tomorrow, leaving little trace that they ever existed at all?